Wikipedia is planning on further whitewashing the history of communism, as if you need to go on Wikipedia in order to learn about the horrors of communism. That's what I thought initially, because here in my country we lived under a communist regime and we know the atrocities. But then I figured out that, hold on a little bit, in the West, for example, in the United Kingdom, they have several months that they dedicate in school so that people can learn about the horrors of the Nazis. And that's a good thing, because they have to learn about that. But apparently very little about communism, almost nothing at all. So it's no wonder that you end up talking to people on Twitter and they're like, capitalism killed more people. Capitalism killed. And I mean, they're uneducated. Simple as. Now, either they're uneducated or they're blatantly lying. So first of all, you need to tackle the word capitalism. Capitalism is not something that capitalists define themselves as. Capitalism is what Karl Marx defined capitalism as. In other words, it's a system where the market is mostly free. You're not going to get the system where the market is 100% free unless it's a failed state. But usually, you're talking about the system where people can sell their labor. That's what capitalism means. And unfortunately, as far as I can see, there aren't many capitalist nations around the world right now. Even the United States officially calls itself a mixed economy. And when you go to Europe, almost every single state calls itself a mixed economy. So, for example, when the government says, okay, we're going to have lockdowns and this part of the economy can't operate because they're not essential business, but this part of the economy can operate. And when you have a welfare state, yeah, that's kind of a mixed economy. It's not capitalism. The idea of welfare doesn't exist in capitalism. So, you know what? Fine. Let's say that all of these mixed economies are actually capitalist nations. Now, when people talk about that a nation is killing people, they're not talking necessarily about war. Like, it's fighting a war and it's killing its enemies. No, it's talking about killing its own citizens. All right, so either ethnic purges like you have in Nazi Germany, starving parts of the population, declaring that a certain class of people is unwanted and then you start persecuting them like the Kulak genocide. That's what it's talking about. So we're not talking about colonializing, like for example, Europe going into America and then waging war against the indigenous population, right? We're not talking about that. Do you know why? Because every single nation around the world has waged warfare. Like, regardless of the economic system they have, humans are very territorial. And whenever one nation could, it took. Throughout the course of the entire history. Like, the only thing that remains true in history is, like, if you can defend it, it's yours. Like, even if now people would go to the moon and colonize the moon, if they can't defend that part of the moon from other invading powers, it's not theirs. Okay, so that is the history of mankind. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about like when a country starts murdering its own citizens. That's what people are saying when they're talking about the crimes that communism has done. And this can happen accidental, it can happen intentional. But here is a chart which talks about famines. So notice how almost no one blames democracies of starving their population. It's usually in democracies people are dying because of morbid obesity, not because they're starving to death. But you know, like this actually goes through the years, and feel free to show me a different chart if you disagree with this, but it goes through the years, and it goes with different forms of government. So the most important ones, obviously, colony. Then you have dictatorships. So you can include Nazi Germany here. You can include China. You can include like anything that's non-democratic, including failed states. So places where the government has fallen and now we have gangs running amok and different warlords and stuff. And finally you have democracies, right? Now the worst famines seem to happen in, number one, colonies. And colony is a form of government that I think the entire world condemns. I don't think we're going to see colonies in the future. And it kind of makes sense why there would be a famine there. Because let's say the English Empire colonizes a country. They don't really care about that country. They just want to extract resources from it. So if the English Empire gets into a war with Spain, they need more resources. So they keep taking and taking and taking, and the people there are suffering. Now, you notice this happening in most occupied territories. For example, after World War II, the Red Army, the Russians, communists, they came into Romania and they did the same thing. They plundered. They took and took and took, and then you have famines because the villages that kept having their things taken couldn't feed themselves. So this is what happens when one nation de facto conquers another one. And as you can see, after 1960, this doesn't really happen anymore. Right? So every single nation on earth now at least points out to the fact that, yes, colonism is bad. And colonism now has a different form. Like, instead of taking stuff from a country, you're taking people. So, for example, in the European Union, the Western countries, they're taking people from the Eastern Bloc. For example, by offering better wages, all the doctors from the Eastern Bloc go to the Western Bloc, and then the hospitals in the Eastern Bloc are very understaffed. And it's not just with doctors, just one example. But this is like modern colonism. You're more interested in taking people rather than taking stuff. But then when you look at the autocratic regimes, when you look at the dictatorships, you see some of the worst famines in history. And the reason you see this is because everything is centralized in a dictatorship. So many times you can even have a famine because of incompetence, because the people in charge are purely incompetent. So, for example, the famine in China, which was caused during the Great Leap Forward, happened because the leaders in charge decided, okay, the sparrow is eating too much grain. So if we can kill the sparrow, then we're going to have bigger crops. And they actually did a genocidal campaign against the sparrow. Well, it turns out that the sparrow was eating locusts and other bugs. And now that the sparrow is gone, the population of locusts explodes, and they're the ones that are now eating all the crops. Also, because it's centralized and the people in power are incompetent, they decided to get the peasants to produce steel. They wanted China to produce more steel than the United Kingdom at the time. So now the peasants are producing steel, but they're not working the crops. And because of that, the crops rot. There's nothing to feed people with. So now you have a famine. So it's incompetence. It's not necessarily malice. It's not that the people in charge want bad things to happen, but they're incompetent, and bad things do happen. Because in a natural economy, you wouldn't have every single peasant on the field deciding to just go out and produce steel. That doesn't happen when you leave people the fuck alone. The second thing is, well, malice. It also can happen, especially in a system like communism, which is based on welfare. So the idea of welfare is always that you need more young working people than you have elderly, because you create the welfare system. So you have more people that pay into the system than people that cash out. And when that happens, you're going to notice, okay, well, if you have an aging population, maybe getting rid of some of the elderly is a good thing. And Stalin reached that conclusion, especially when you realize that the elderly are probably more conservative in their mindset. So you're solving two problems. Because when you're a dictator and you control everything in the state, then everything bad that's happening in the state is your fault. So you need to distract people. It's not your fault. It's the counter-revolutionaries to blame. It's the kulaks. It's like everyone else is to blame but the people. And when you blame someone else, like for example, the Jews in Nazi Germany, like you're trying to get the citizens to blame them rather than the leading people, rather than the party. And this leads oftentimes to genocide. It leads to bad things. Usually when you put citizen against citizen, well, the conflict is going to have to resolve itself somehow. And this is why people keep saying that communism kills. Right? Because the idea that people should go on the street in a revolutionary manner and risk their lives just so that they can experience a famine later on, or just so that the government can kill them later on, makes absolutely no sense. It makes a lot more sense from a human nature point of view. It does make sense from a human aspect on why the average Ottoman in the Ottoman Empire would be loyal to the Ottoman Empire and he would join the military to conquer other people. Because you would be like, okay, we're conquering these people, then we take resources from them and my family and I can live better. But it just doesn't make any sense on why a person would go onto the streets demanding for revolution so that him and his family can live worse. It's against the revolutionaries' own interest, basically. And I think communists know this, but they're trying to obfuscate it. It's like, oh, well, people die under capitalism. Yeah, man. Okay. And by the way, I don't think a system is perfect, but I think if you can avoid this, it should be condemned, just like colonialism is condemned. No one wants colonialism. No one wants this shit. Also, I'm actually curious what happened in St. Lawrence Island of Alaska. I'm going to have to look it up. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you in the comment section. Take care.